We've been covering lots of the stories by Byline Times into allegations against Dan Wootton, and this one's a little bit of a corker. That's because for the first time, they've got people to talk on record. So the headline is this: Dan Wootton's celebrity targets revealed. And the celebrity targets they spoke to are The Only Way is Essex star Kirk Norcross, Big Brother contestant JJ Bird, and an X Factor singer in his early 20s. On his interaction with Wootton, Bird told Byline this: Dan told me he was an amateur photographer and was working with underwear brands. He invited me to a test shoot at his flat with a fee attached. At that time, I was trying to fund my boxing career and develop my career in entertainment. Dan was a big name in the world of showbiz journalism who had the power to do that, plus anything where I was going to receive payment would obviously have been very useful. Looking back now, it was a complete abuse of power and position, and he should not have been offering to do that kind of thing. Byline go on to report this. Mr. Bird said Wootton contacted him first on Facebook, claiming, quote, "There is one person who I'm working for at the moment who's really keen to get you for work." In later messages, Wootton changed it to two people I'm working with, adding, quote, "It's just a test shoot, so low key, so not for publication. We'll still pay, obviously." And then a quote from Wootton: "Just you in various sportswear, swimwear, underwear, which I'll run by the man I'm working for before he decides how to do a full shoot, which could be for publication. Just to be certain, could you text or email me a quick shot of you shirtless now? But I'm pretty sure we'll want to go ahead now because we don't necessarily need you mega ripped. Anyway," Wootton followed up by saying the shoot would be at mine in E1, adding that they also want to know if you will do a couple of nude shots too, because they do a lot of that and they don't necessarily need your face in. Mr. Bird declined and told Byline Times, quote, "I wasn't having any of that." Byline also write up this account from a celebrity they haven't named. So I think this is the singer in their early 20s. "Dan invited me to do a test shoot for some underwear brand for £1,000. I went along thinking it was a semi-pro shoot and might help my career because Dan was at the time on ITV's Lorraine show and working for the biggest papers. The studio was just his front room. It felt really awkward, especially as he was so well known. There was nobody else there, just us. There was no backdrop or anything like that, despite Dan telling me it was a shoot for these brands. He just gave me normal boxer shoots to wear. I changed into them in his bedroom. I thought it was all strange, but rolled with it. He was so influential, I didn't want to offend him somehow. Then the stuff he was asking me to wear became more and more revealing, and alarm bells started to ring. He brought out latex stuff, which I refused to wear. He also asked me to pose nude, but I refused to do that too. The whole situation was weird and was not what I was expecting. Dan refused to pay me the full fee we'd agreed because I wouldn't go nude. It creeped me out." Dan Wootton Hansen or his team haven't responded to those particular allegations from Byline. I mean, what do I think about this? Why are we talking about this? You might be watching this thinking this is just gossip. You know, no laws were broken here. I mean, it doesn't seem like any laws were broken in this particular case. I think it is creepy, though, and I think it is deceptive. It seems to be deceptive if you're telling people we're going to do these shoots because I know people who, might work in fashion, et cetera, and then you're asking people to do quite compromising stuff. I mean, it doesn't seem pleasant. And the criminal thing I think is interesting because when it came to sort of Philip Schofield or Hugh Edwards, what some people were saying is this is a storm in a teacup because they haven't broken any laws, right? This is a private issue and it should be a private issue. But with Philip Schofield, obviously Dan Wootton was one of the loudest voices in the media, sort of really ramping that story up the media agenda. With Hugh Edwards, Wootton was on holiday, but GB News was probably the outlet that was going hardest on him. And I think this has led lots of people to sort of ask the question, why is this Dan Wootton story, which is being gone hard with by Byline Times, they're releasing sort of revelation after revelation or allegation after allegation, I should say, and it's not really getting picked up in the other newspapers or outlets. Why is that? Why does there seem to be this double standard? Well, one theory is just he's less famous than the other two, which I think undoubtedly he is. He's a very big deal in the industry. As you saw from those quotes, lots of people think of him as sort of the most powerful celeb journalist around, or at least he was when he was working for the Sun and the Mail. Now he's got more of a public-facing persona. But Hugh Edwards, of course, Philip Schofield, both household figures. Dan Wootton, not so much. Another theory, though, which I do think is quite interesting, and I think probably has something to it, is about what kind of institutions would have made this a story that blows up. And I think they are, the Sun, the Daily Mail, GB News. So when it came to Philip Schofield, when it came to Hugh Edwards, it was those institutions, the Sun, the Daily Mail and GB News, that were really, really putting pressure on the BBC, etc. And if those three institutions are either your current employers or your former employers, then that gives you a degree of protection, I think, because no one is going to really go after their own or someone who was was once their own.
I actually think a lot of people are sleeping on GB News as a media brand and its ambitions. Angelos Frangopoulos, I think, who's their top guy, said recently that they want to be, the number one news media brand in this country by 2028. Now, with the BBC, that seems unlikely, but they're clearly highly ambitious in terms of market share with regards to radio, with regards to their website, which has grown to an extraordinary extent, and of course with broadcast TV. They are very ambitious. Now, if you look at BARB, their ratings aren't going through the roof, but they're gently rising, while the trend is down, generally speaking, for Sky and the BBC. I think it's quite plausible that really it's a bigger media news brand than, say, Sky within 3 to 4 years. I think that's very, very, very possible. And at which point you do need to have real scrutiny on people leading that project. And Dan Wootton was, until recently, I suspect he still is, the host with the biggest audience on GB News. So despite the fact they have Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nigel Farage and Michelle Dewberry, etc., or Eamon Holmes in the morning, big names, particularly Eamon Holmes and Farage, and you would expect them to have the biggest shows. Actually, Dan Wootton tends to get the biggest pull of anybody at GB News, and that's the show, his show, which is a 2-hour show. It seems to be building a really loyal audience. He bangs on about Meghan and Harry and all sorts of stories like this in a way that, frankly, very few others do in the British media landscape, simply because he has a 2-hour sort of block every night to talk about this stuff. The way he's behaved in the past is hugely relevant. If he's the star boy of a media brand which wants to be one of the country's biggest by 2028, then that's of huge public interest, And Byline has done an extraordinary service by getting this journalism out there as promptly as it has. So I don't think it's tittle-tattle. I think it's very important. Now, finally, one of the reasons why I think it's not been reported to the same extent as Schofield and Hugh Edwards, and I'm sure this pains Dan Wootton, is that he's just simply not a household name like those two are. Everybody in the country, Michael, has heard of Philip Schofield. That is why that story had legs. I remember him from being 5 years old, watching him in the BBC broom cupboard with Gordon the Gopher, all the way through now to him being, he was until very recently one of the most marketable, bankable stars on ITV daytime television. To a similar extent, Hugh Edwards, this was the anchorman for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. I don't think you can really put Dan Wootton in the same category as those two with regards to public recognition, although I'm sure he would like to be. I think that's why it's not been the same story. Clearly, if you had this kind of scoop on a Philip Schofield or a Hugh Edwards, I think it would have broken into much of broadcast and print media. With Wootton, I think, like I say, because of his status, it's being interpreted, which I don't think it should be, but it's being interpreted really as sort of inside baseball within the media rather than a story of real public interest and political interest too.